Hello, creeps. Welcome to another episode of The Mortuary. I'm your host, Morbid Tuna, and this is where we talk about horror films and related geekery. Today, I'm going to be reviewing 2024's Nosferatu. It came out on Christmas Day 2024. It's now 2025. Happy New Year, everybody. But I'm going to be talking about this symphony of horror that is the most recent iteration of Nosferatu. For those of you who do not know, Nosferatu 2024 was a remake, and not the first remake of this particular story. The original Nosferatu came out in 1922, 103 years ago. It's still awesome, by the way. If you haven't seen it, watch it. Go at once. Go and watch it now. The first remake came out in 1979. The story is a ripoff of Dracula. You see, way back at the beginning of the 20th century, a German director named F.W. Murnau decided he wanted to film the story of Dracula. The author of Dracula, Bram Stoker, was deceased by that time. His widow, however, had control of the rights to her husband's book, and she refused to allow Herr Murnau to make a film version of her husband's book. He did it anyway. He just changed the names, but the story was basically the same thing. The Count wants to buy a new residence, originally in England, in this version in Germany, and a young, up-and-coming real estate agent is sent by his firm to the Count's castle to get him to sign all the legal stuff. Of course, when he gets there, he soon discovers that the Count is more than just an eccentric old aristocrat. He is, of course, a vampire. It doesn't go too well for the poor young man, especially when he discovers that the Count has this strange obsession with the young Herr Hutter's fiancée. He then has to race back home to try to stop this monstrous creature from preying on his poor, unsuspecting fiancée. The help of an expert in the occult ends up being enlisted. They, of course, manage to join forces and defeat the evil Count in the end. So that story was copied by the filmmakers of Nosferatu, and Bram Stoker's widow was not pleased. She, in fact, made every effort to track down and destroy every copy of the film that she could. Luckily, she was not successful and a few copies survived. And so Nosferatu, a symphony of horror, was released in 1922 and has since become an absolute classic of horror films of the silent era. This nightmare of a film was created, and some of the most iconic, the most recognizable images in the black and white horror era came from this movie. The 2024 Nosferatu is a modern version of that impressionism. The stark, grim, very gloomy feeling of doom and dread just pervades this whole thing. And it's at once clearly a recent film, but at the same time very much a period piece and very respectful to that original vision. Something else that gives this film an old-timey feel is, on top of the way it looks, there's the way that the characters speak. It's set in Germany, as I said, mostly, in 1838. And while the dialogue is in English, the way the characters speak to one another has an old-timey feel and cadence to it. The words they use, just the way they express themselves. You won't find any verbal anachronisms in there. It's very much written the way that novels from that time were. The characters speak to each other in a way that is natural, and seems to flow organically, but at the same time there's a certain poetry to it. It's the way that we would imagine people speaking generations ago when diction and vocabulary were very much emphasized in school, and anyone of any standing whatsoever would have this thoughtful and eloquent way of speaking. Now, I hasten to add, not all the characters speak with this poetic flow to them, and that makes sense. Most of the characters are sort of middle to upper middle class at the time, so they would have been reasonably well educated. We can believe they would have spoken that way. There are a few like working class characters, porters and hospital orderlies, who have a rougher speaking style, less florid and more to the point, which of course fits their character. There are no slips, there are no little bits of modern speech that kind of seep in there. You can still believe these people are part of this time and this place. All the characters fit together nicely into this world. Nobody seems to be out of place at all. Speaking of the auditory part of this film, the sound is really well designed. You have the whole spectrum of highs and the lows, the trebles, the basses, and everything in between, and it's all very rich, and it's very, at once, pleasing to the ears, but it also creates the tension and the dread, which, personally, of all the definitions of horror, whether it's revulsion or jump scares or what have you, dread, horror in the sense of dread, is my favorite type of horror, where there is tension that is slowly ratcheted up. Think of The Changeling, 1980. Think of The Shining. Think of a lot of the films from 1980 and before, where there was less gore, less jump scares, and more just creating this feeling that something is wrong. And it just gets more and more intense. I'm not saying there are no jump scares. I'm not saying there is no gore. There is. But this film clocks in at 2 hours and 15 minutes. And over that period of time, the jump scares are very sparse. The gore, when it happens, is fairly intense. But again, it's very carefully placed. It's not just all over the place, it's not just random, it's not gratuitous. I mean, this is a story about a vampire. Vampires, as we all know, survive by killing people, by draining their blood. And if you mess with them, they will probably kill you also. Therefore, you know there is going to be some gore. And it's fine. When it happens, it fits into the story just fine. It never seems to be just gore for the sake of it. And it never ever overshadows the dread either. Like I said, the tension and the dread is what drives this horror film forward. The monster himself, Count Orlok. There have been many versions of vampires seen on film over the years. They all brought their own flair to the character. When they did give the Count an accent other than their natural one, it was generally the Dracula accent. In the story, Dracula's from Transylvania, which is now part of Romania, so it was that I have come here tonight to suck your blood. It was that accent. The original Nosferatu, like I said, back in 1922, had no sound. There's nothing to copy. So that gave this film the freedom to do its own thing when it came to the way Count Orlok speaks. And in this film, he speaks like no other version of the character of Orlok or Dracula has ever spoken. He has this accent that doesn't sound like an accent I've ever heard, and the impression it leaves is that it's an accent that nobody has anymore, because he's so ancient that the language he spoke when he was a human way back centuries ago is now dead. That's how old he is, and the way that Bill Skarsgård, who plays the character, speaks gives you that impression that he is from another time, and it works very well. He even speaks in his language a few times with subtitles. It sounds kind of like Latin. If anyone knows what language it is, please say so in the comments. I would be fascinated to hear. Anyway, the point is, his accent and the way he speaks contribute hugely to his character. Not only does he have this unique accent that I mentioned, but he speaks in this very sonorous and slow manner. The pace of his dialogue is very deliberate. It's like he knows he has forever. He does not rush because he's been around for centuries. He's seen it all. He's done it all. He's in no rush at all. And he's a nobleman. He's used to having people listen when he speaks. You stop and you listen when Count Orlok is talking to you. In fact, there's a scene when we first meet the Count where he impresses upon the hapless young Mr. Hutter that he insists on being addressed not as Sir, but as my lord. Right off the bat, we see that this creature, whatever else he may be, is still clinging to the traditions of the old world where you address the aristocracy by their proper aristocratic title. The thing is, of course, while he may have been a nobleman a long time ago, that isn't what he is anymore. He is a vampire, and he is not the kind of vampire that we have seen in recent years. He doesn't sparkle, he isn't pretty, he isn't just so full of woe and, oh, I hate my power, and, oh, I'm just so depressed, and the world is so dreadful. No, no, no. He's a monster. He looks like a monster, and he has been a monster for so long. And when I say he isn't sparkly and he isn't pretty, I mean it. This Count Orlok is cadaverous. He's gross. He is the way that vampires were for hundreds of years before Dracula was invented, which was only in 1897, so not that long ago. But legends of vampires have been with us for millennia. And in a lot of traditions, vampires could not pass for human. They don't look human. They look like walking corpses. Orlok is somehow bloated and emaciated at the same time. He's not just wrinkly, he's partly decomposed. You can see some exposed bone here and there, and yet he doesn't seem frail at all. You can tell there's enormous power lurking in those undead sinews. He is straight up scary. He is terrifying. He comes out of the shadows at his slow and stately pace, and all you can think of is, please don't get any closer. Please just leave me alone. He really is like a nightmare on two legs. Now, one more thing I want to say, comparing the original to the current version of Nosferatu, is that the original 1922 film was only 87 minutes long, not even an hour and a half. This one, as I mentioned earlier, is 2 hours and 15 minutes. But it never drags. It never feels as though it's padded either. This seems like they've taken the story and added to it in a way that only makes it better. There's more on Orlok's origin. There's more on the background of Elena, or Leni as they call her, the main character. There's a lot more of her background. She, in fact, becomes much more of a central character. Her character and Orlok's slowly form this dichotomy that's really cool to watch happening. The script tells us that Leni has been having strange dreams all her life. They basically say that she's got some sort of psychic ability that regular people don't have. She's tuned in to the unseen, which of course makes her more receptive to the dark forces in the world, like Count Orlok, whose abilities are also expanded upon from what we saw in the 1922 film. So, speaking of Elena, or Leni as I'll call her for the rest of this video, That brings me to the casting, because Lainey is played by Lily Rose Depp, the daughter of the famous Johnny Depp. And like I say, Lainey is a central character, if not the central character, in fact, of this story. And Lily Rose Depp plays her absolutely beautifully. She is at once a victim of Orlok's evil machinations and also a victim of the social attitudes of her time. The doctor who comes to see her dismisses her strange symptoms as a melancholy. Oh, she just needs to lie down. We just need to give her some ether. It's this, this dismissive, patriarchal, patronizing, oh, that's all right, silly young woman, you just sleep it off and stop thinking about it and everything will be fine. So she's not only being victimized by this supernatural monster, but she's being dismissed, not believed, and basically written off as a lunatic by the men of science who are supposed to be helping her. Lily Rose Depp plays this character so well that you start to forget after a while that she's just acting a role. She makes you really sympathize with her and empathize with her. You feel how helpless she feels. The audience is living through her, and she really gets to you. You feel for her, you want her so badly to prove everyone wrong, but also you want people to take her seriously, but before it's too late, obviously. On top of everything I've just said, poor Lainey has to deal with the fact that even when people start dying, people still don't believe her, because the Count's arrival is in perfect sync with an outbreak of the plague. So while the whole city is in a panic about this very real plague, it is killing people off, but it's sort of covering these other deaths, which are, of course, Orlok going around draining people's blood, as vampires do. The thing about the time period as well is it was a time that was very much ruled by reason. Reason, you could almost say, was the new religion. The Enlightenment had happened. The old ways were just superstitious. Anyone who believes in the unseen must be completely mad. They need medical treatment. Science and medicine can explain everything. That was the order of the day. And whether Orlok is aware of that or not, it works to his advantage, which adds also to the terror created in this film. I think we can all identify with being really afraid of something or a situation and not having anyone believe us. And that's what happens to poor Lenny. Even her own fiancé is doubtful. Perhaps it's wishful thinking on his part, that it's just something that she can rest up and get better from, but even he doesn't believe what's really going on. He had encountered Orlok back in his native land, so he knows what he's capable of, but he doesn't believe that Orlok has actually come to Germany and is there now in their presence. I think he just doesn't want to believe it. He barely escaped with his life. He's finally made it back to his fiancée, and he just wants to protect her, and I think he does know in his heart that Orlok has followed them there, but Hutter is in denial. Even he would rather listen to the science of the doctor at first than believe that there is a vampire who wants to take his fiancée away from him. And I was very, very impressed with this film. The writing is great. The casting is perfect. The sets, the costumes, the cinematography, the pacing, the music, the sound design generally, everything is just perfectly balanced. There's not one weak actor in the whole thing, and as great as Lenny is as a character, for me, as a horror fan, the really important part is Count Orlok himself. His design is slightly different from the Orlok we saw in 1922 and in 1979. Here's some pictures of what they look like. So you can see similarities, the pointy ears and the rat-like fangs that are on the front two teeth rather than on the incisors, as they often are for vampires. The bald, pasty look and the long claw-like fingernails. And the long fingers are there with the big pointy nails. The general cadaverous look that I mentioned, but there are some design differences. which I will let you discover when you see the film for yourself, which for the first few moments I sort of thought, what the heck? But all doubts are very quickly dismissed, all fears allayed, because the way Bill Skarsgård plays him and the way the character is designed just works perfectly with the rest of the story, where they have definitely done their own thing with Count Orlok, but they have kept the essence of what makes him scary, is that he does not look like some handsome tuxedo-wearing guy who's going to come and charm you. He looks like the monster that he is. And he certainly behaves like one. There's one particular scene in this, which I won't spoil. I'll mention it down below in the comments. One that doesn't happen in a lot of horror movies. When a monster does this, you know that there is nothing it won't do. And that makes him all the more terrifying. And not just in a, wow, he's so scary, but also kind of cool sort of way. No, no, no. He is just straight up terrifying and repulsive. And you don't want to be within 100 miles of this guy. That, to me, is what vampires should be like. That's the best version of a vampire, is the one that you see and you basically crap your pants because you're so terrified the moment you lay eyes on this thing. I have now said a whole lot of positives about this movie. I've basically been raving about it the whole time. And normally I would now add some criticisms. But you know what? I can't think of anything. There is nothing, not one thing that I can say about this movie that wasn't just spot on perfect. It's excellent from top to bottom, start to finish. It is perfect. It is a symphony of horror. And for that reason, I'm going to give this film a perfect score. 5 dead tunas out of 5. Well, that's it for this particular review. Thanks for tuning into The Mortuary. If you like what you see, and if you like what you've heard, by all means, hit the like button, hit the subscribe button. Go tell your horror-loving friends to come on by my channel and listen to me talk about horror movies and comment, get into the discussion, respectfully, of course. Stay tuned for my next review, coming at you in a couple of weeks, right here on The Mortuary, with your host, Morbid Tuna. This is me saying, slash you later.